Good morning and welcome to the Town Hall Summit. The day has finally arrived. I'm so delighted that you could join me and our wonderful guests. I hope that you've signed up for all four of these sessions. They are going to be fantastic. We have global leaders from three continents talking about the impact of the first 60 days of COVID-19 on leadership and what it means for leaders. Hopefully, over the course of these couple of days, you'll get wonderful tips that you can take with you and that you can apply in your day-to-day. I am so excited to announce the first panel, but let me tell you what we're going to do first. So we have four sessions over the next couple of days. The first one is leading in the new normal. Exciting stuff. What does it take to lead in the new normal? The second is innovation and entrepreneurship. We know that out of crisis comes great opportunities for innovation. So we'll listen to some amazing innovators and entrepreneurs talk about what they are doing and what they're seeing in the marketplace globally. We will talk to founders about what it's like being a founder stroke CEO during crisis and how they are trying to continue to build and sustain their businesses through all of the things that are changing environmentally day by day. And last but not least, we'll have purpose-driven leadership, operating with purpose, doubling down on the strategies around diversity, corporate social responsibility, and philanthropy that companies need to do to ensure that their customers and staff understand their commitment to people through this change. So we're really excited to get started. If you don't know me, I am India Gary Martin. I am a leadership expert, advisor, and executive coach. I am delighted to be able to do this. The culmination of the Town Hall Summit came from having conversations with a number of clients, conversations with colleagues around industry about how we are going to sustain ourselves from a health and well-being perspective, from a strategy perspective, from a leadership perspective, as the COVID-19 crisis continues to perpetuate and even some new information begins to emerge, how we manage that decision making. But without further ado, I'd like to jump into leading in the new normal. I'm so excited about this group. There are wonderful I call them titans. They wouldn't probably, but titans of industry who are joining me for this. So I'd like to make introductions to them. You will have seen there on the promo just before, you will have seen their short bios. If you want to read their long bios, please go to the website, www.townhallsummit.com. You can see all the details about them that you want to, but I'm still going to do an introduction to make sure that we get this right. First, we have Kimberly A. Blackwell. Kim is heralded as one of the country's top executives in new media, marketing, and advertising. Kimberly is a technical, strategic, and creative consultant and trusted advisor to the C-suite of publicly and privately held companies in the areas of brand, culture, change, management, organizational effectiveness, digital transformation, and inclusion through the channels of media, high tech, and experiential. She's an influencer working her magic on the world's most well-known brands and is a multipreneur shaping small and mid-cap businesses alongside working her magic on some of the world's most well-known brands. Welcome, Kim Blackwell. Colin Coleman is an amazing leader. I had the pleasure of meeting in South Africa when I was working there a few years ago. But in addition to being heralded as one of Euromoney's top 10 financing leaders for the 21st century, and the World Economic Forum's Global Leaders for Tomorrow, Colin Coleman enjoyed a long career at Goldman Sachs, most recently as CEO for Sub-Saharan Africa. Having left that post in January of this year, Colin is now a senior fellow and lecturer at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. Welcome, Colin Coleman. It's wonderful to have you here today. I would like to welcome Betsy Miller. Betsy is co-chair of Cohen Milstein's public client practice in Washington, D.C. In addition to being a practicing lawyer, she's an adjunct law school professor, author, public speaker, and certified leadership coach. She does it all. Named among the Law Dragon 500, she's also recognized as one of America's 50 most influential trial lawyers. Betsy is the current co-chair of the Women's Leadership Forum at the National Trial Lawyer Summit and is known for her expertise in complex negotiations, navigating difficult conversations, and cultivating leadership in the law. Thank you for joining us, Betsy. Welcome. Last but not least, I'd like to welcome Shaka Rashid. I've known Shaka for many years, and he is a force. A leader for all of his life. I had the pleasure of meeting him while he was a student at Morehouse College in Atlanta as class president, no less, and again as managing director and senior client advisor with JP Morgan Asset Management, where he led the firm to secure its first ever $1 billion alternatives strategic partnership mandate with a large public pension. Shaka was shaking things up from has been shaking things up as long as I can remember. Shaka is now the MD and GM, Managing Director and General Manager of Capital Markets at Microsoft in New York. He's also worked in leadership roles at firms like Bridgewater and Lazard Asset Management. Shaka, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I know you're super busy, so glad that you had the time. Welcome. When I started having the conversation and started preparing for the town hall summit, there are two significant pieces of research that I used, which will drive a lot of the conversations that we have. One of them is the Edelman Trust Barometer for 2020, which measures and monitors trust and how people are generally feeling about a number of different factors and a number of different measures. But it was really useful in framing some of the questions that I will ask, and I hope that you can see that reflected. The second piece of research was Better Decisions, Brighter Futures, the 2019 Corporate Social Responsibility Report from Moody's Corporation. And I used that piece because I wanted to ensure that I understood how corporations were responding to not just the crisis, but the kinds of frameworks they put in place to be able to manage their businesses when increasingly people are demanding that businesses be more responsible about their communities. I'm going to stop there in terms of kind of setting the frame. I'd like to kind of start the conversation. And I'm going to start with Shaka. Shaka, you've worked at both boutique and institutional kind of and large kind of institutional financial services firms. You've also led through crisis. I mean, in 2008, you were well in the leadership seat. The question is kind of around what you experienced differently in those organizations with regard to decision making, particularly given organizational size and maturity as a baseline. So, the kind of question is, in a smaller boutique firm, or do you have the ability to be more agile, for example, in making decisions, particularly in times like these? And what are you experiencing differently in both? And then further, which I'll kind of throw in later, is what that means in terms of what return to work looks like, or how you might shape what happens in the future for your organization, given that you're new in the seat from January. What does that look like?
So that's fair. One, thank you for having me. When I think about this issue, it's pretty interesting because I don't find that there's a necessary correlation between size and care. So there's an orientation. I've had different experiences from large organizations, smaller boutiques, but in different groups, right? So you have different experiences. But the one consistent thing I found is that firms who are truly empathetic, meaning having an orientation towards their customers, towards their employees, but really putting themselves in their shoes, kind of take the stance differently. So Microsoft's a fairly large organization in terms of the number of people, 150,000 people, but the uniqueness around the empathetic part, the orientation of saying, I understand that this would be a difficult time and that your kid may be joining your Teams call or that it may be difficult for you to schedule things out. And so we have to make sure that we allocate time for our colleagues and our customers to be able to be human. I think is an experience I'm having now. I got to tell you, so I've 25 years in Wall Street before a technology career, and the variance of that just really differs from the on high orientation about being empathetic. So the things that I've seen now, it's interesting because when there's also the universe of tools that you can have at your discretion. I happen to report to a leader who actually levered having a what do you call that device? A hovering craft. What do you call that? Self-guided thing. But happen to have a remote picture. He said, "Like, here's me, a drone." Thank you. I'm searching for the word. But here's a drone picture of me at home, and just to make the connection richer, you have to have an orientation of being empathetic and a committedness around what that means for the people that you work with and the people that you serve.
Wow. So what does that look like? What is the shape of that going into this crisis? Like when people are talking about returning to work, what does that look like for you in terms of how you think about your people moving into those spaces? And obviously, you're a technology company, so technology companies had to leap on this in a lot of ways, right? Because remote working was not something that was new. But what does that look like for you when you think about that in relation to empathy, even?
Yeah. So one clear thing is that there's no clear orientation of what kind of crisis we're in. Is this a V shape where we'll quickly come out? Is it an L shape where it'll be enduring? Is it a U shape where it kind of malaise and evolve over time? There's no clear orientation about how we will come out, but there's clarity that we're in a difficult challenge. One of the things that you find is that they need to be clear and consistent in what you communicate, right? So the fact that there's frequent communications required. One of the things that we're seeing is the evolution of clearly the need to be more collaborative. So we're having this forum in the tool that affords us the opportunity to see each other. Imagine doing that as well in the same form we're exchanging and looking at the same document, right? I'm taking a pen and I'm writing on it. The need to do things more like that, of course, is going to be more pronounced, and we're seeing that. And for us, there's an orientation to gain greater understanding. So, assessing, understanding the risk around you. What are the ways that you're able to take information and have your own thinking, but also have supportive mechanism, machine learning, artificial intelligence, as a mean to delineate and make greater sense out of the inputs that you're receiving. So we're seeing a greater need for those kind of things to evolve. And then there's I think, a world that we're going into that's more of a differentiated customer person experience, right? The ability to try to understand and grab more attributes of understanding about the person, the institution that you're interacting with in a way that allows you to engage them in a better way. So tons of tools around that. Microsoft, is a firm that is at the forefront of that, right? So the ability to create these tools that create greater agility in how you're able to pull that information and lever that information to make more informed decisions and better interactions. But at the end of the day, it comes from a source of being rooted in being empathetic as the start to saying, how do I figure out what to do and who I'm doing it for in a better way?
Awesome. Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Does anybody else have anything to add to that? I mean, it's interesting because when I think about all of those things and we think about the role of technology, I keep reflecting on the fact that actually, imagine if this happened 10 or 12 years ago where we only had phones, really. It's challenging enough, having these conversations on Zoom calls all day. I think we all have Zoom fatigue. But what if we were doing this on our phone? The challenge that would present is almost unfathomable. I mean, does anybody else have a thought about what they're seeing and experiencing in the same space? Okay. Then I can move on to Colin because Colin, this actually leads me quite well into what I'd like to kind of share and ask you, and that is kind of I think it was last week or the week before. You wrote in the Times that your former boss Lloyd Blankfein taught you the folly of making predictions during periods of uncertainty and the importance of using risk management as the overarching framework for sound decision making. And so I kind of, and that is, it is pure folly trying to predict anything right now. I mean, I think it changes every 3 minutes. But can you kind of talk about two things? One, kind of how you employed that strategy and some of the things you may have seen, particularly in crisis, during your time at Goldman. And then second, what you believe the weak spots are in emerging markets. Because I mean, this is a global conversation. And while, we're all sitting in different places, I'm in Washington, I think Kimberly's in Atlanta, Betsy's also in Washington. Shaka, you're in Connecticut or New York?
New York.
Um, New York, and then Collins in South Africa, and that you'll see that through this summit that people are in all kind of different places and spaces. But emerging markets are really important, and it's important we think about how they are operating during these times because they fuel growth in the global economy. And so I just want to get your view on how South Africa in particular, but also more widely, what the weak spots might be as we kind of go into these periods of uncertainty.
Well, thanks very much, and again, thanks for having me on. The nature of this crisis, perhaps relative to other crises, is more fluid and dynamic than perhaps any other crisis, in the sense that this is a crisis no one expected. It's unprecedented in scale and in scope as a health crisis. And in many respects, we are experimenting as we go, whether it's in the United States or in places like South Africa or other places. And you see nations make their crisis based on the choices that they make and how they conduct themselves. So in South Africa, there was a very early lockdown, and that lockdown, flattened the curve, but it made the economic activity here, immediately stop. That's, what many of the economists say is in other crises, we've seen depressions, slowdowns, and so on. Actually, what you've seen in this economic scenario is an economic stop, which is devastating to the global economy. So in South Africa's case, it probably means that whereas the economy was headed towards probably a 1% pre-COVID growth, it's probably going to end up at a 6% contraction and 1 to 2 million jobs lost in South Africa, which will take our unemployment rate from pre-COVID 24% to over 30%. So our unemployment rate makes the United States 15% unemployment rate look benign. The economic impacts of the lockdown, which was early on, is our biggest issue that we have to deal with. That went over a period of time into our fiscal stimulus plan, which took longer to get there, but basically was a very good plan. And I was watching somebody on CNN talk about the US plan, saying effectively the US plan was basically the right plan, that the combination of Steve Mnuchin and Chairman Powell's plan has been very strong. But the United States has a huge amount of leverage, is much bigger, started off with a much better balance sheet than most countries. In South Africa, we started off with a relatively weak balance sheet and a small open economy. And so whilst the basic decisions of the government, I think, have been very good decisions, what we're left with now going into the future is a situation where our death rate is very low. We're in the hundreds rather than in the thousands of deaths in South Africa, but it's early days. But on the economy, we have a huge amount of inequality mixed with a large amount of unemployment. And so there's a huge amount of calls to open the economy, just as you're seeing in the United States. I personally think that you have to be very, very careful, because opening the economy too soon will lead to a spike and a rapid rise in the infection and death rates, which in turn will dampen the economy, because you'll have to retrace your steps on economic opening as the pain of that surge in COVID hits the society. So it's a very dynamic process, and I think in terms of the subject of this panel, which is leadership, it reminds me of diplomacy. You've got soft power and hard power. You need, on the hard side, you need the strength of leaders, you need the capacity, you need the technical capacity, you need the strength of decision, but at the same time collective action. On the soft side, you need to be reading the mood of people, and you need to be reading the ability to be compassionate and lead in a way that you're taking people with you, because this is all in the end legislated, but also requires the population to coalesce and to agree and comply with lockdown regulations. So it's I think this is a very complicated set of leadership issues. It's a very complicated set of societal issues, but people have to put the nation first, the national interest first, and each nation needs to act in a global collective, because it's no good. This crisis will thrive on excellence in one place and chaos in another. The chaos will rule, and you will have, the rise in the crisis. So I watch Andrew Cuomo in New York think he's absolutely excellent. I watch other places in the US, and I'm shaking my head because I think that what's going to go on in the US is you're going to have rapid rise in these states where there's too early opening and irresponsible, it looks to me, uh, you know, opening without controls, without the 14-day infection rate going down, as Anthony Fauci has warned America yesterday. And I think it's the same with nations. If South Africa does well and the United States does badly, but the United States citizens travel to South Africa, they bring COVID with them, and so on and so forth, and vice versa, it's just going to be a mess. So everybody in the world needs to, I think, be cautious, be prudent, be decisive, and find a way through this crisis.
That's awesome. I mean, I think really, really interestingly, when I was looking back, as you were saying some of those things, my underlying kind of initial research around trust kept emerging in my head, and some of the numbers that I heard. And one of the things that was really interesting, one of the things that I read, and I'm just kind of looking down through it now, was that there was one of the measures that Edelman asked in the report, or one of the statements that people made was that I worry about people like me losing respect and dignity in a country that I once enjoyed. So, like in my own country, this is how I feel, and the impact of particularly economically on certain groups of people, and potentially all groups of people eventually. Um, is huge when you think about what that means for how people feel about themselves. And one of the interesting things was that I think in 21 of the 28 markets measured, in terms of people feeling that way, South Africa was at 63%, the U.S. was at 55%, the U.K. was at 49%. So we're talking like basically above 50% of the people feeling really concerned about what this will mean for them longer term. Everybody feels that way, but just in terms of trust and dignity and respect. And so it's a really interesting time to be having this conversation, especially about business, because you can't separate people from business, right? Because they are the, I mean, there's folks of us who sit in leadership seats, but the reality is, everybody else, people are doing the work physically in their various spaces. And so you can't separate those two. So kind of the emotional piece of this for people. We can't forget what that feels like. People are on the grief curve in various shapes and forms, right? Some people are kind of still in denial. Other people are in the depression part of the curve, and others are kind of moving to what are the opportunities that we might be, what's next, and how do we move forward? And anything can throw people backwards or forwards on that curve at any time. And so just kind of thinking about the people piece of this and what this means for people who actually have to go out and do the work, I think is a big thing. And so, I think when we think about that as leaders, Betsy, you and I've had lots of conversations about a number of these kinds of things. But specifically, one thing I found really interesting is you're really well known for your research and thought leadership around polarities. And we had this conversation, which was really funny. I actually did my research so that I could set up what the polarity framework is. And so I'm going to say a little bit about that, but I'm going to ask you to kind of talk about it in relationship to this crisis and how people might leverage it in decision making around some of the tough things that are going to come our way that aren't going to go away. So the kind of idea around polarity management is that instead of solving a problem and moving on, you manage the dilemma. The dilemma comes from the tension between the two ends of the spectrum, or the kind of two competing polar opposites that are interdependent. The framework, in the polarity framework, you identify the strengths and weaknesses of the two poles, and then you focus on the strengths. So basically, you solve problems, but manage the dilemmas you face in work and life. So, like for example, work-life balance is a good example of that. You don't solve it, and it's done. Instead, you balance the tension between working and not working by recognizing the strengths and weaknesses of both. Or like health is another great example. You don't get healthy so that you never have to invest in your health again. You kind of have to balance the polarity between the two. So, problems are not ongoing things. They're things that happen and you move on. They're solvable and they tend to have, alternatives that are mutually exclusive options. Polarities are ongoing. and they need to be managed together to optimize the situation. So that's kind of the frame. I hope that I gave some amount of background on what that means and how that shows up. But I kind of wanted to ask you, Betsy, that polarities during crisis are much more acute, right? They are absolutely much more acute, and they have to be managed even more intentionally. So, can you talk about what it means for practically for leaders in the current crisis and how you're seeing it emerge in your space, but more broadly?
Sure, and I appreciate both Shaka and Colin's lead-in because a lot of what you both said is really relevant to this framework, and I think the reason that that is because the framework is not a new idea; it's as old as yin and yang, and the notion is that there are times when we need to move away from either or thinking to a place of both and. And either or thinking really serves us well if we are in a cave and a woolly mammoth comes to attack us and we have kind of the choice of do we stay or do we go? That is a very different situation than when you are confronted with a paradox or a polarity of should I be hard or should I be soft? Should we approach this with candor? Should we approach this with diplomacy? Should we focus on the task? Should we focus on the relationship? The answer is both. And the trick to this is it's not so much actually a balancing. You're not trying to get 50% of one and 50% of the other. You're trying to leverage the benefits of both. And when you are able to hold the benefits of both, you're actually creating something slightly different. And what's nice about the framework is that it's a very, I think, neutral and forgiving way for people to understand that we can all fall into overuse of our preferred pole. I, for example, am somebody who tends towards the candid side of things. It's not that candor is bad, but if I were to be fully candid all of the time to the exclusion of ever being diplomatic, there would be no one left to talk to. You can sort of imagine how that would happen. And I want to give just a little bit of context for this um, in a leadership framework, because coming from the legal profession, it is a funny business. We are a talent driven business. We are a service business. We don't produce anything at all other than our words and our ideas. And yet, historically, the legal profession has not really invested in cultivating talent in terms of the whole person and the whole leader. And so I'm on a bit of a mission in my own career to try to change that. And I actually see this crisis, when you try to look for the silver linings and bad things that are happening, as a bit of an opportunity, because I think what we all need to understand is recognizing the type of challenge that this crisis is presenting to us. And by that, I mean, it is an adaptive challenge. It's not a technical challenge. It's not one where we can say, let's go get the tools out of the toolbox and just use them to address it. It's one where we actually have to evolve and build new capacity and confront the reality of, in order to make space for that new capacity, we have to decide what are some of the core values and traits and qualities that we need to make sure to preserve in ourselves, in our organizations, in our culture, and what are some of the things that we need to shed in order to make room for that evolution. Because if anyone has kids and ever has read that Eric Carle book about the crazy zoo animal that just keeps putting on, he's got the head of a zebra and the toe of a lion and the nose of an elephant, that doesn't really work out genetically. What you need to do is sort of march towards an organized evolution of incremental innovation. And so I want to bring that back to the concept of polarities, because we could spend, and I have spent years and days and hours talking about the framework. But one of the pieces of it that I think is most present in this particular crisis is the core polarity of stability and change. And the reason I mention that one is because in chaos, there is a tendency in leadership, because there is a call for leaders to do this, to soothe and to say, everything is okay. It's this, you can recognize what's happening. Let's brush aside the uncertainty and let's keep things stable. And so I think we all know, as sitting here as leaders and being into month 2, 3, 4, 6, depending on where you are in the world of this crisis, that things are not stable. And if we left things exactly how they were, we would not be able to adapt and evolve and thrive and come out the other side. However, if all we did was push for, and I think those of us sitting in organizations can imagine what a disaster this would be, let's drop everything, do it all differently, the degree of that disruption and the impact that that would have on our customers, on our clients, on our employees, it would frankly, it would break the system. And so the stability change polarity here is particularly present for me because it's both generous and also a call to action. What it tells us is that we need to get the benefits of identifying the core pieces of what we need to keep ourselves functionally stable through this. What are our touchstones? While also making sure that we are leaving room to be open and curious and actually giving space to innovation and change and new ideas because we are not operating in the same world that we were 6 months ago.
Well, great. Thank you for that. I mean, that is, I think a part of this, if anything, is being able to get people to be able to pull out strategies they can leverage as people are watching this, that they can leverage in their day to day. I mean, this is uncharted territory for business. All of us are kind of in a new space that we haven't been in before. Things are coming at us left, right, and center. And I think the ability to be able to process and kind of apply decision making frameworks quite quickly in ambiguity is really hard to do. So I'm Betsy, thank you for sharing that, because I think that giving people something to leverage when we're trying to kind of figure our way through this is just really, really useful. So thank you for that. Kimberly, there we've been again having conversations. I think I've spoken to all of you in various forms about various things. But one of the things that really struck me before I kind of get into the question is about you being a multipreneur and kind of seeing this from small business all the way through big business. And that in addition to kind of being an investor, you're a CEO of another company, and you also have a client base of Fortune 100 companies across the world. But more than that, what I found interesting is that's great on the business side, but you also have a great insight into government, having been on the National Women's Business Council, like one of 8 female CEOs to advise the White House and Congress and the Small Business Association. So in both the Obama and Trump administration. So you've kind of seen this from both sides. So one of the things I'd kind of like to talk to you about is what the pivot looks like for in these various spaces for folks, right? The kind of the what it means for small and mid cap, what it means for kind of your bigger corporate clients, and then kind of the intersection of government and just some of the issues people are facing.
Yeah, sure. And again, thank you, India, for having me. I think there are a lot of common threads to the points made earlier. I want to kind of go back to one of the things that Shaka said in answering your question. There are a lot of synergies in what you see in the big business discussions now, as well as the small business conversations. Looking at ways in which how folks are restructuring, looking at ways of realignment, reimagining one's business. And so what I find is that in leading in this now normal, right, you have to also be planning for the new normal. And so for me, leading now also is examining the teams. One of the things that we may have seen recently is the whole thing with Jack Dorsey and Twitter. He's taken a avant-garde approach to what work from home will mean for that organization, and even though it is of the digital industry and sector, I think a lot of companies will be looking at what does work from home mean for their organizations. There will be some implications to that, but what I also see is that in big business and small business, folks are looking at overhead. What does leadership look at? I tell people, like, now to me there's a big R&D plan of research and discovery and Operation Find the Fat. Folks are looking at what ways can we reduce expenses within our organization? How might our footprint look differently? There was an article in the New York Times today really kind of talking about real estate and how folks are having to look at, especially in New York, what will that look like in our new normal? And so, for me, I think, one of the things that I'm seeing too across big business as well as small business is really kind of like, what does that governance, what is the culture of that governance team? And what I mean by that is that a lot of times in organizations, you used to hear commonly around think globally, but act locally. Now I think it's think globally, act globally. And you need to do that in ways in which we are, as an entrepreneur, looking at innovation, looking at how we become more creative and efficient through efficiencies, how we are digitizing our organizations, how we are really looking at efficiencies, how we are looking at, to Betsy's point, talent. I think talent and the way we build our teams are going to look different. Is going to look different. Pardon me. And then I also think too, it's this whole attitude of winning. I'm enjoying the pleasure of watching The Last Dance, featuring Michael Jordan and that whole journey. And there are a lot of leadership lessons. And it's one of those things where it's winning has a price. That's my line. Winning has a price, and so does leadership. And I think what folks are doing now is really making not just good and bad decisions, because as Colin said, this is fluid. Like this is a learning curve and where we're being baptized by fire. But it's not about good and bad decisions. It's also about tough decisions. So in leading in this new normal too, you're also looking at, I love how Shaka also mentioned the care perspective and how we're looking at people. Brian Chesky, co-founder and a CEO of Airbnb, as those of you who may have seen in the news, wrote a very interesting letter that we might not have seen given the pandemic circumstances to the workforce around the 1900 or so of 7,500 that they're going to have to transition as employees. But it was all done in a tone that I don't know that we've heard from most C-suite leaders or those who are running large organizations. There's a human connection that is being oversubscribed now, but I think it's definitely one that is with merit. And I think as we look at, no matter how big our businesses are, what we need to do in a gig economy where you have solopreneurs that are now going to have to look at how they may be impacted, and also in the way that we do it in big business.
That's I mean, that's true. On that one. Are we getting some feedback? Am I only hearing that? Okay. So this is really interesting. Again, reflecting on the trust stuff, 87% of people are now saying, and this is that kind of human piece, that stakeholders, not shareholders, are most important to long-term company success. Right. So the people piece is emerging, and that 74% of CEOs, 74% of people are saying that CEOs should take the lead on change rather than waiting for government to impose it. So folks are looking to business to be able to drive what this new normal is going to look like across a multitude of spaces. Business will impact a whole bunch of others based upon its leadership, and folks are looking to business for that. As I mentioned earlier, that competence is something that people ascribe to business. That's who they're looking to around the competence or demonstrated competence to lead through this crisis. And then the other thing I found interesting was that consumers are expecting brands to act. They want to see the names that they know and trust acting. And so brand can be a really powerful force for change. But people are basically saying, I expect them to represent me and help solve societal problems, and my wallet is my vote. Right. So kind of with that in mind, and kind of having that, thinking about how that shows up in your businesses. Shaka, do you want to can you talk a little bit about just kind of what your thoughts are around that?
Absolutely. So one, I've really enjoyed this discussion. It's right at the heart of the things we're experiencing. One is you recognize that there's change to come, but not quite acutely of how that manifests itself. So in terms of facilitating a curiosity, we call it a learn it all orientation. in our organization, right? The fact that you don't explicitly have to have the answer, but you have to be curious to ask the questions about the how. So, love thematically, we're talking about entering this new environment. And so, for us, I had a conversation yesterday. Let me back up a minute of a 50-year-old senior executive at a global private equity firm who earnestly conveyed, he said, for the first time in my life, I'm exclusively using a laptop. Like this is something saying, I had phone and all that, but there's an orientation that you recognize that there's an educational component of understanding the utility of those tools. Many people are using collaborative tools like our teams, right, and having the type of video conferencing or some of the devices where you build more collaboration. But there's an orientation that there's a training required. There's some sort of J curve to investing in understanding what is available, how to use it for you, that is required to get to the other side where you then have efficiencies born out of that. So we're seeing a lot of play out in many different businesses. We're raising questions about that. And I tell you, there's a realization, one of the benefits of this environment is that it's prompting change in ways that may have taken decades to realize in terms of, there is an absoluteness that we've got to do something in order to be in a better place in the horizon, and probably wouldn't have taken the medicine required to getting there. And so, we recognize and are very empathetic to the fact that it is difficult to change sometimes. And as leaders, it's important that you articulate and you drive people to thinking about that polarity dynamic that Betsy talked about, right? The things that we're defining. In fact, yeah, we need and want that change, but there may be difficulties in getting there and helping people through that. So, as an organization and a business I lead are across financial services firms who are experiencing this unprecedented acute pain in their industry. And we're helping them just to think through that in the utility of collaborative tools and ways to assess risk and using machine learning, artificial intelligence, and thinking about how do I create the data lake around me to know more about what's happening with my customer, what's happening with the people who are on my team and at my firm, and how I'm able to then make better referenced recommendations, suggestions, questions, even about what to do about it. So it's a uniquely interesting time. Let me pause.
No, that's awesome. That's great. I think in about probably 4 or 5 minutes, we're going to go to questions. But there are a couple of things I want to kind of pull out from the panel based upon things people said. So you can start in the Q&A box. You can start asking questions, and I'll come to those after we've had the conversation here. But one of the things, Betsy, that struck me about what you said, and then Colin, what you were talking about, and I'll start with Betsy, is that, and I'll ask to kind of keep this within a minute so we can move. But what are you seeing? What kind of advice do you have for people in the legal space right now, Betsy? Because it's an interesting time for you. I mean, again, you're a very, as you mentioned, people-driven business, and the ability to be able to connect with people is much more challenging. So, what does that look like in terms of how you interact with your stakeholders, your clients, and your teams, given especially the I mean, though the work that you do is technical, a lot of what you do is influence in terms of your ability to do that as a trial lawyer, of course. So, can you kind of talk about that just a little bit? Because I think that would be useful for the folks who are on from the law.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tough time for lawyers, just like it is for everybody else, because we're operating within the confines and restrictions of some systems around us. And imagine what would happen if the wheels of justice just ground to a halt for the next 12 months, not just the criminal justice system, but also the civil justice system, and what would happen to people's rights and what would happen to unresolved problems that companies are trying to get their own answers to. Um, so I think it's very challenging. I mean, I guess I would say something more general, which is, and I think I mentioned this last time we spoke, India, there's a Bruce Lee quote that really sticks with me right now. And that is that under duress, we do not rise to our own expectations. We fall to the level of our training. And so what I would say to the legal profession is catch up on this, because the business world is ahead of us on it. But the training we should invest in is adaptability. and understanding how to move from this either or space, which our lawyer brains are trained in law school to do, because that's why we are able to give our clients good, crisp, soothing answers. And to lead through this crisis, we have to shift into this both and mindset. And as Shaka was saying, do it with a learner's mindset. Curiosity is not a badge of shame, it's a badge of honor. You can both have expertise and also be curious. And so that is a tough shift for lawyers, because people call on us to give them answers. And in a crisis filled with uncertainty, the answer has to be, here's how I'm going to help you hold it through here, but I can't give you the exact thing you're asking me to do.
Great, thank you for that. Colin, I'll pop up to you just in following up on some of what you talked about. What do you see as being some of the? I mean, I think there's an issue. Obviously, you talked about the unemployment rate, right? That's one thing that I think is leapt out at me in our conversation. We're talking 14-15% in the U.S., but up to 30% in South Africa, and what that means, how that might show up in terms of trust with government, and what the expectation is around what government will do for people in that space. And then actually what government has the capability of doing in terms of having a limited resource pool already, in terms of being able to shape that. So can you talk a little bit about how you think that might show up and what that might be?
Well, it's a complicated question, but let me just pick up some of the issues in the panel and come back to the specific of your question. I think the theme that I'm getting, which I want to bring it down to, is within the complexity of this very fluid environment that we've been talking about, there are going to be winners and losers. There are going to be nations that win and lose. There's a whole debate about, is China going to rise relative to the United States because of this crisis? If you look at emerging markets, South Africa has done very well, New Zealand has done very well. Peru and Turkey, for example, are just highly concerning. The amount of deaths and infection rate in a place like Turkey is, it's only twice the size of South Africa's economy, but it's about 30 times the number of deaths in Turkey. It might be on a decline, but it's on a decline from an extremely high base. So the impact on that nation is devastating. So there are going to be nations that win, nations that lose. And then within nations, there are industries that win, industries that lose. And in global economy terms, everywhere, the real estate, the leisure, tourism, entertainment industry, many of these industries are being devastated around the world. And then you have the technology industry that's clearly a winner. So you have the online commerce platforms like Amazon, Alibaba, various others in various countries that are gaining, and you see it in their share prices as well. And then you have, within countries, you have regions that win, regions that lose. You have communities that win, communities that lose. And then ultimately you've got families, that are doing better or doing worse. And that comes back then to the nation, because the problem with inequality in this crisis is absolutely crystallized to everybody. So you have various mainstream economists calling for universal basic income grants. You've got people like Gary Cohn yesterday, who was calling for a revision of the entire tax system in the United States in order to pay for this fiscal stimulus and to reset the economic distribution of resources in society, precisely because the inequality, the winners and losers in society, is getting aggravated by this crisis. So it's a very complex system. What can governments do? Governments have effectively now come through. We see these cycles where business thinks that they're the all-important actor in society, and then they get smacked by events, and suddenly you realize that governments are very much in control of setting the tone for society and for business, and this is one of those times. And so it's very important that governments lead. Now, I think, if I had to sort of say, generally speaking, what do governments have to do? They have to stabilize their societies. They have to stabilize the fiscal and social and health impacts of this crisis on their societies, number one. Secondly, they have to modernize and restructure, and they're going to have to effectively go through a period of their own vaccine or their own cures for the actions that have had to take in this crisis. And then ultimately, the world is going to restructure to, for example, this whole working at home, working with technology. One of my favorite hobby horses at Yale University is the whole question of technology disrupting public service delivery. Because I think now it's very certain that passports, visas, education, health, all manner of public services are going to be delivered online. You're not going to go to government offices to get these things anymore. In 20 years' time, I'm absolutely certain you can bank on that those services, just like consumer online services getting delivered to the home, those services are going to get delivered to the home. And you're going to have a very different balance of employment in the world, with the government employment system looking radically, radically different.
Perfect. And so I'm gonna move into Q&A, and actually, Kim, the first question here is for you, which brings me right around the circle comfortably. But the question here is, what you talked about innovation and entrepreneurship. What can small business do to differentiate themselves during this time when access to capital may be challenging, but also how do they establish a space in the world considering the COVID-19 crisis?
Great question. I think, again, we serve as a consultancy arm to the Fortune 100. What we're doing now is over communicating by way of business solutions. I think, again, people come to us kind of seeking the big idea, but as well as the implementation. And for small business, I always say, where do you fit within the value chain? You want to make sure that, in the sense of adding value, to your clients, to your customers. You want to look at ways in which you can kind of get in front of, whether it be more through the digitizing your platforms. I am also saying that, PPP was one of the sources of funding for many small business enterprises here in the States. But for some, they were not able to access it. Just as we're seeing that people of color were disproportionately impacted by way of the health implications to COVID, we're also seeing that in small business. So I would also look at ways in which you can collaborate with other businesses. I think that's going to become a new model too, in the way in which we look to scale and bring value to others. I also think that, I will say this, India, you talked about surviving 4, well, I can button up and now say 3. Between 9/11, the economic downturn, I founded my business out of a 600 square foot apartment 21 years ago, right out of college. And for me, it was always in the power of the pivots and looking at how is it by way of recovery, reentry, and always through resilience, that I was always looking to provide what was it that I could see by gap variances and things in which we know that as sometimes as small business, we look at things through a different lens. This is where I actually think big business is going to get better. I think they're going to take more of an entrepreneurial lens, and somebody mentioned the speed of decisions that we'll see. And I think for small business, we've kind of always been that go-to. And how do you make it smarter, quicker, faster, better? But I still think that, to the point of not just stabilizing, we can't be in a sustainable mindset. We need to be in a thriving mindset. I do believe there is another side and other side to this, and looking at ways too in which you maybe look at direct to consumer models as being a faster trend in the way that businesses will look to perform on the other side. And then always considering, how is it that you use your network? I tell folks, you have to differentiate in business, you have to diversify in business. And one of my other favorite D's is dial for the dollars. Don't be afraid as a small business to use and position yourself in ways in which you can add value.
Awesome. That's a good answer. I don't think there's more to say than that on that subject, but it leads us into the next question. I think we'll probably have space for one more, maybe two, depending on the length of the answer. And I really like this one. And that is, given the liquidity in giving the liquidity premium markets now, are you still investing? And if so, what asset classes are you particularly keen on? That's a great one, I think, for anybody. I mean, Shaka, Colin, Kim, Betsy, anybody. I mean, this could be personal. Well, it's going to be personal for any of us, but anybody have a view?
Let me
Yeah,
go real
I
quickly.
want to.
Shaka probably has the scientific, more technical answer. Mine is real quickly. Yes, I'm still investing. Most of my investments now are going into fintech categories. But I would say if you are in a position, and notice I said if you are in a position, so invest responsibly. There are a lot of great deals that are happening now.
Yeah. And so these are my personal comments. One is the only free ride to investing is diversification, right? And so the being oriented around that, even as you have conviction around ideas, is just a principle I'd say to honor. The other thing I say, which is the big miss for many, is simply not investing enough. And so being very clear about what you're targeting, what your objectives and goals are, what you're investing for, the duration of that horizon, like retirement, for example, or next month or vacation should it ever happen again. Those are different objectives. So being clear about what you're solving for. And it does require some sort of discipline orientation. So for me, classically, I'm very wired to saying being very diversified. We've not changed our investment portfolio, which is solving for retirement and kids' college education, things like that.
Excellent. Thank you.
I
Thank you for
would just
that.
maybe just comment quickly if I can. Just,
Please.
it goes back to your question you asked me about risk management. This is not a time to bet or gamble, right? This is a time to be very conscious of risks around you. And I mean, I happen to think that the markets at the moment are factoring in what I could call the V recovery, wherein in fact it's very possible, perhaps likely, there will be a U or an L recovery, which will mean the markets will have to rebalance downwards quite significantly. Somebody called the S&P 500 the S&P 5 because the current markets are reflecting, the tech giants being supported by the retail market rather than the overall S&P 500. But the facts are, if there is going to be, the kind of economic collapse over an extended period, the earnings of the companies are not going to do anything other than reflect that, and then you will have a significant rebasing of the market downwards, which is many of the economists are predicting. But again, risk manage, have a strategy which accommodates various outcomes rather than one bet.
Awesome. So we're at 11 o'clock, but I'm going to have go do one more question. Betsy, I'm going to ask you this question. If you can keep it brief so we can let people go on. I know that we're time boxing, we got caught, but I think this is a great one for you in closing. Is we've talked about a lot of the hard stuff. How can we as leaders support our communities, colleagues, and family and friends to rise from some of the emotional kind of feeling that we're having at the moment? And how do we motivate each other to move from a sustaining to a thriving mindset, given what's happening in the current environment? I will close with that one.
It's a multi-part question with a time limited answer. So, I was one of the great joys for me in this at-home time is the richness of content that is both interactive and available and really high quality from friends and colleagues in the leadership coaching space and organizational development space that's being made available to everyone for free. And so I was sitting on one of these many calls somewhat recently, and this one happened to be Salesforce's call with Brené Brown. And she said something that for folks who read her stuff, and I certainly do, really stuck with me. And that is, it is a time to reward people being honest about failure and struggle. It really is a time to encourage and support your colleagues, your family, your bosses, your employees, your organization to be open and honest about that the fact that it is struggling and also that it is looking to rise through this. And so I guess I would leave you with two very quick things. Thing one is, do take advantage of the enormous outpouring, the generous outpouring of wellness and leadership material that is out there right now. And that's everything from mindfulness practices, pause practices, free yoga classes, to the type of seminar that India gives and others in this leadership space give. And the other is to understand that the challenge we're facing, while uncertain how we make our way through, is as old as time. And for anyone who is a fan of reading mythology, this is the hero's journey that we are in. We have been called to action, we have been called to adventure, and we have had to depart from things that we know are safe and recognizable. And we are smack dab in the middle of what that journey calls the ordeal. We are facing our demons, we are reshaping ourselves. We hope that we will come out transformed and better so that we can bring our more expanded selves back home to our organizations and our families in this new space. And I was just having a conversation with my husband about this last night as we're kind of cooped up in the house together, about what growth opportunity is here for us as individuals and as parents. And I take that very seriously as a person and as a boss and as a colleague. And I would just say, to echo Brené Brown, bring your whole self into it and to be kind and compassionate to yourself and to others, as the fellow panelists have also said. So thank you.
Thank you, Betsy. So with that, Kimberly A. Blackwell, Colin Coleman, Betsy Miller, and Shaka Rashid, thank you for giving us your wealth of knowledge and sharing with us your wealth of knowledge on leading in the new normal. Thank you very much. We will be moving at 11:15 a.m. Eastern Standard Time very shortly to our next plenary session, which is innovation and entrepreneurship. We hope to see you there. Thank you.